Thomas, what do we do?
A boy woke up inside a dark underground lift. His mind was blank. He couldn't remember who he was or how he got there. Panic gripped him as the lift rattled and shook, rising steadily toward an unknown destination. Then, a strange noise. His eyes darted toward a small box in the corner. He hesitated, then leaned closer. Inside the box, staring back at him, was a pig. Confused and disoriented, he tried to make sense of what was happening, but his thoughts were a blur. Before he could think further, the lift came to a sudden stop. The doors slammed open, blinding light flooded in, and before he could react, dozens of boys were staring at him. A boy named Glade stepped forward, grabbed his hand, and pulled him out. But the moment the boy's feet touched the ground, fear took over. He turned and ran. He sprinted as fast as he could, desperate to escape, but after a short distance, he stopped. His heart pounded. He was trapped. Massive stone walls surrounded the entire area, stretching high into the sky. There was no way out. Before he could process what was happening, the boys caught up to him. They grabbed him and threw him into a cage. A boy named Albie, the leader, stepped forward. He looked at the frightened newcomer and began asking him questions, but the boy had no answers. I don't remember anything, he admitted. Albie sighed. That's normal, he explained. No one here remembers anything except their name, and even that comes back only after a day or two. Hearing this, the boy remained silent, struggling to process everything. Albie studied him for a moment, then said, "Promise you won't try to run again?" The boy hesitated, then nodded. With that, Albie unlocked the cage. His new life had begun. As the boy followed Albie through the strange place, he listened carefully. Albie explained that everyone here had arrived the same way. They had all woken up in the underground lift, just like him. And now they survived together. They built houses, hunted for food, and did everything necessary to stay alive. If we need anything, Albie continued, it comes through the lift. We call it the box. That's how you got here too. The boy listened, his mind racing. Who had sent him here? Why couldn't he remember anything? And most importantly, what was this place? Every month, new supplies and a new boy arrived in the box. But no one knew who sent them or why they were here. The mystery only deepened as the boy's eyes locked onto a massive door built into the towering stone wall. Before he could ask, Albie noticed and spoke firmly. There are 3 rules here, he said. First, everyone does their own work. Second, no one harms anyone. And third, never, ever go through that door. The boy nodded, but his curiosity only grew. Later, as Albie walked away, a friendly-looking boy named Chuck approached. "Hey, don't worry too much about the rules," Chuck said with a grin. "You'll get used to it here." But the new boy wasn't listening. His eyes remained glued to the mysterious door. "What's behind it?" he asked. Before Chuck could answer, the door creaked open. 2 boys, Ben and Minho, stepped out. The boy's heart pounded. "Wait, Albie said no one is allowed in there," he blurted. Chuck smirked. "Not everyone. Only a few boys can go in. That's them. They're called runners." "Runners?" "They explore the maze," Chuck explained. "That's what's behind the door, a giant maze. They go in every morning and come back before dark." The new boy's curiosity exploded. His feet moved almost on their own. He had to see it up close. Just as he stepped forward, wham! A powerful shove sent him crashing to the ground. Gally stood over him, glaring. "Stay away from that door, newbie." Anger flared inside him. He jumped to his feet, ready to fight. Then suddenly, the giant stone door slammed shut. A deep echoing silenced the area. The boy swallowed hard. What was inside that maze? That evening, the boys threw a celebration for the newcomer. Laughter filled the air, but the new boy's mind was elsewhere. Then Newt sat beside him. "I know what you're thinking," Newt said. "You're not the first to ask about the maze." The boy leaned in. "For 3 years," Newt continued, "the runners have been trying to map it. Every day, they go in as soon as the sun rises. And? Did they find a way out?" Newt sighed. "Not yet." The boy frowned. "Then why don't they stay in at night and keep looking?" Newt's face darkened. "Because anyone who stays in the maze after dark," he paused, lowering his voice, "doesn't come back." The boy's stomach tightened. The maze wasn't just a puzzle. It was a trap. No one had ever survived a night in the maze. Not a single person had returned alive. Because once darkness fell, the grievers came out. Monstrous creatures lurking in the maze, hunting anything left behind. The thought sent chills down Thomas's spine. But instead of fear, he felt something else. Determination. He wanted to be a runner. Hearing this, Newt chuckled. "Not so fast, Greenie. Runners aren't just picked for fun. Only the best of us get that chance." Thomas clenched his fists. Then I'll prove myself. Before Newt could respond, wham! Thomas stumbled forward, nearly falling. Someone had bumped into him. It was Gally and his friend caught in a rough wrestling match. Gally turned, smirking. You want to prove yourself, newbie? He taunted. The boys around them perked up, sensing a challenge. That Gally pointed to a circle drawn in the dirt. Step in. Let's see if you can throw me out. Thomas hesitated. He had no idea how strong Gally was, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. Fine, let's do this. As soon as the match started, Gally charged. Thomas barely dodged in time, struggling to stay on his feet. Gally was fast and brutal. The crowd cheered, encouraging the fight. Thomas fought back with all his strength, pushing, twisting, trying to find an opening. But then Gally's foot slammed into his chest. Thomas crashed to the ground. His head smacked against the dirt. Pain shot through his skull. And then a memory flashed in his mind. A name. His name, Thomas. That night, his dreams were even stranger. He saw himself running, through hallways, through corridors. Then, a lab, bright lights, a woman's voice. Wicked is good. The words echoed in his mind, repeating over and over. Thomas jerked awake, sweating. What did it mean? The next morning, Albie took him to a wall where names were carved into stone. These are all the boys who've come before you, Albie explained. But then, Thomas noticed something. Some names were crossed out. What about those? Thomas asked. Albie's expression darkened. Those boys didn't make it. A heavy silence filled the air. Thomas stared at the names. For the first time, he truly understood. This place wasn't just a trap. It was a test of survival. Thomas wandered into the forest, searching for supplies, when he suddenly froze in place. Skeletons. Dozens of them hung from the trees, their empty eyes staring down at him. A chill ran through his spine. Before he could process what he was seeing, a rustling sound came from behind. Ben. Thomas turned and saw him standing there, but something was terribly wrong. Ben's body trembled. His eyes were wild, filled with something inhuman. Ben? You okay? Thomas asked, stepping back cautiously. Ben growled. Before Thomas could react, Ben lunged at him. Thomas barely dodged in time. His heart pounded. Ben's face was twisted in rage, and his breathing was ragged like a wild animal. Without thinking, Thomas grabbed a skeleton hanging nearby and swung it. Crack! The bones smashed against Ben's head, but he barely flinched. Thomas's blood ran cold. Help! He shouted, turning and sprinting back toward the colony. Ben chased after him, fast and relentless. The trees blurred past as Thomas ran for his life. Just as he reached the colony, Newt stepped in, fast. Wham! Newt's fist slammed into Ben's head, knocking him to the ground. Gasping for breath, Thomas stumbled back. The others quickly restrained Ben, tying him up. When they pulled up his shirt, everyone fell silent. A gruesome, twisted wound stretched across his stomach, black and swollen. It looked like something had burrowed into his skin. Thomas felt sick. What is that? He whispered. Albie stepped forward, his expression grim. He's changing. Albie explained that the grievers, the monsters in the maze, caused this. They stung people, and those who survived went through the changing. But this was the first time it had happened in daylight. Ben screamed and thrashed, his body convulsing. The boys had no choice. As the massive stone doors of the maze slowly closed for the night, they shoved Ben inside. His terrified screams echoed as the doors sealed shut. A heavy silence followed. No one spoke. Everyone knew what would happen next. Ben wouldn't survive the night. That night, Thomas's dreams were even worse. He saw the lab again, the same woman, but this time there was someone else, a girl. She was there with him, in the experiment. Her face was blurry, but something about her felt important. Then the voice echoed again, wicked is good. Thomas woke up in a cold sweat. The next morning, Thomas spotted something strange. Albie, who was not a runner, was heading into the maze. Thomas turned to Newt. Why is he going in? Newt's face was unreadable. He's following Ben's tracks. He wants to know exactly where Ben was stung. Thomas swallowed hard, watching as Albie disappeared behind the massive stone doors. Something about all of this felt wrong. And deep down, Thomas knew something terrible was coming. Newt told Thomas something shocking. Albie was the first to arrive in this place. For an entire month, he lived here alone, before any of the other boys started coming up through the box. Thomas tried to imagine it, being trapped in this strange world, completely alone. It sent a chill down his spine. That evening, tension filled the air. Everyone stood at the massive stone doors, their eyes filled with worry. Albie and the runners hadn't returned yet. Minutes felt like hours as they waited. Then, a figure appeared, Minho. But something was wrong. He was staggering, sweat dripping down his face, and on his shoulder, Albie, badly injured, barely conscious. A collective gasp spread through the group. But before Minho could make it back, the doors to the maze began to close. Panic set in. The boys screamed for them to hurry. The stone doors rumbled, moving faster. Minho was still too far. They weren't going to make it. Then Thomas moved. Without thinking, without hesitating, he ran straight into the maze. Just as he crossed the threshold, the doors slammed shut behind him, trapping them inside. Thomas's heart pounded. The maze was now his prison. Darkness surrounded them, stretching into endless stone corridors. And then, a sound, a deep, inhuman growl. Minho turned to him, eyes wide. "You idiot!" he hissed. "You just killed yourself." Thomas ignored him and rushed to Albie. One look and he knew Albie had been stung. The grievers had already gotten to him. His breathing was shallow, his body convulsing. "We have to save him," Thomas said. Minho shook his head. "Once you're stung, you're done." Then, Thomas noticed something, a vine-covered wall nearby. An idea formed in his mind. "Help me," he told Minho. Minho hesitated, but then grabbed Albie. Together, they hauled him up, weaving the vines around his body, securing him above the ground. Not a second too soon, a shadow moved in the darkness. Something huge, something alive. The griever. Minho bolted, vanished into the maze. Thomas froze. The creature was right there, sleek, mechanical, deadly. Thomas held his breath. If it saw him, he was dead. The griever lurched forward, scanning the area. Its grotesque metal legs twitched. Its slimy, pulsating body shuddered. Then, it hadn't seen Albie, and it hadn't seen him. But Thomas realized something else. This wasn't some nightmare. This thing was real, and if he wanted to survive the night, he had to find a way out. Thomas's heart pounded. This wasn't just a monster. It was something worse. A machine. The griever wasn't a living creature. It was a robot designed to look like a monster. Cold, ruthless, deadly. As soon as it disappeared into the darkness, Thomas let out a slow breath and returned to freeing Albie from the vines. But then, a chill ran down his spine. Something was watching him. He turned. A griever loomed over him. Its grotesque, mechanical body twitched as it lunged forward. Thomas ran for his life. His feet pounded against the maze floor, his breath ragged as the griever closed in. He knew the truth. He couldn't outrun it. If he kept running blindly, it would catch him sooner or later. He needed a plan. His eyes darted across the maze until he spotted the wall, vines, bushes. Without hesitation, he jumped. He scrambled up the wall, gripping the vines. Just as the griever leaped after him, its razor-sharp claws dug into the vines, trapping it for a moment. That was all the time Thomas needed. Right then, Minho arrived, panting. Thomas's eyes darted to the maze walls. They were closing. A crazy idea hit him. "Minho, follow me." He lured the griever toward the narrowing path. It chased him relentlessly, its massive body crashing through the maze. The walls were closing in fast. At the last second, Thomas dove to the side. The griever wasn't fast enough. Its huge, mechanical body got caught between the closing walls. With a sickening crunch, it was crushed. Thomas had just killed a griever. The next morning, the entire glade was in shock. Thomas and Minho had survived the night in the maze. But more than that, they had brought Albie back alive. Minho turned to the group and said, "We killed a griever." Silence. Then whispers. Disbelief. A new hope flickered in their eyes. For the first time, they realized maybe the maze wasn't unbeatable after all. After some time, everyone gathered for a meeting. Gally was furious. Thomas broke the rules, he argued. He should be punished. But Minho had a different opinion. He's talented. He saved us. He should be a runner. The group murmured in agreement, except for Gally, who remained angry and defiant. Then, a sound interrupted them. The lift was rising. Too soon. The Gladers exchanged uneasy glances. That wasn't supposed to happen. They rushed to the lift. Inside, a girl. Thomas's breath caught. He knew her. She was the same girl from his dreams. A small note was clutched in her hand. "She is the last one." Before anyone could react, the girl suddenly opened her eyes. She scanned the crowd and in a faint voice said, "Thomas." Then, just as suddenly, she collapsed again. They carried the girl to a hut and let her rest. Meanwhile, Thomas couldn't sit still. "I have to go back to the maze," he said firmly. There were too many unanswered questions. Minho agreed and chose 3 more runners to accompany them. Together, they stepped into the endless stone corridors. After some time, they made a chilling discovery, a griever's corpse. Something about it seemed off. Minho bent down and inspected its leg. "Look at this," he muttered. Embedded inside was a strange-looking device. Carefully, they removed it and took it back to the colony. There, they examined it closely. One word stood out, printed across the device: wicked, the same word that had been written on the supplies sent to them. A heavy silence fell over the group. It was clear now. Whoever had been sending their supplies was also responsible for creating the grievers. Thomas was still examining the strange device, trying to make sense of it, but Gally was not happy. He broke the rules. Gally insisted he should be punished. Newt, however, disagreed. "Let him spend one more night in the maze," he said. "If he survives, he deserves to be a runner." Later that evening, Minho took Thomas to a small hut. Inside, a map, an intricate layout of the maze, carefully drawn on large sheets of paper. Thomas studied it. The maze was divided into 8 sections. Minho explained that every day a new section opened, and it always followed a specific pattern. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he noticed something. The device they had found on the dead griever had a number 7 marked on it. What if the griever came from section 7? Thomas wondered aloud. The realization sent a chill down his spine. But before they could discuss further, a commotion outside. Shouting. They rushed out to see Teresa. She was standing on the watchtower, throwing things down at the boys below. She looked panicked, confused. Then her gaze landed on Thomas. She froze. The aggression disappeared. Thomas climbed up to her, his heart pounding. She watched him carefully but didn't resist. "Do you remember anything?" he asked. She shook her head. "Just my name, Alice," she whispered. Her name was Teresa. "And there was one more thing. I kept saying your name in my sleep," she admitted. "But I don't know why." Her words made Thomas's mind race. Something about this felt familiar. Then, Teresa reached into her pocket. She pulled out 2 small blue bottles. On them, the same word. Wicked. Thomas suddenly remembered something. A voice from his dream. Wicked is good. The phrase echoed in his mind. If that was true, then maybe the injection from Teresa's blue bottle could cure Albie. Without wasting time, Thomas stepped forward, ready to give Albie the injection. But Albie started screaming, thrashing violently, his body twisted in pain, his eyes filled with terror. Before anyone could react, Teresa seized the moment. She quickly injected the serum into Albie. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, Gally stepped forward, furious. "You broke the rules again!" he shouted. Without listening to any explanations, he ordered Thomas to be locked up for the night. Later that night, while Thomas sat in the cage, footsteps approached. It was Chuck. He had snuck in, carrying a small bundle of food. Thomas smiled. "Thanks, buddy." As they ate, Chuck's expression turned somber. "Thomas, I don't even remember what my parents look like," he admitted. His voice was small, almost lost in the darkness. "I don't know their faces, but I made this for them." He pulled out a small, handmade doll. His fingers traced over it gently. "Someday I want to give this to them." Thomas felt a lump in his throat. Looking at Chuck's hopeful face, he made a silent promise. "We'll get out of here. I promise." As soon as morning arrived, Thomas and Minho wasted no time. They dashed into the maze. Their destination? Section 7. This part of the maze shouldn't have opened for another week, but today it had. As they ventured deeper, something caught their eye. A torn piece of clothing, Ben's clothes. The realization hit them hard. The griever must have dragged him here. Then, a strange sound. Thomas turned toward the device they had found earlier. It was beeping, a steady rhythmic sound. Thomas's heart pounded. What if it's guiding us? Without hesitation, he started following the sound into the unknown. With every right turn, the strange beeping sound grew louder. Thomas and Minho followed it carefully, navigating through the maze. Then, they arrived at a place Minho had never seen before. A massive bridge stretched before them, leading to a solid wall at the far end. But just as they approached, the device in Thomas's hand lit up, and suddenly, the wall shifted. A hidden passage opened in front of them, revealing a dark cave. Curious yet cautious, they stepped inside. The moment they did, a blinding light flashed. A strange scanner flickered over their bodies, analyzing them from head to toe. Before they could react, the cave walls started closing in. "Run!" Minho shouted. They sprinted at full speed, dodging falling debris. But just as they reached the exit, a massive wall collapsed in front of them. For a moment, it felt like they were trapped. But at the last second, they squeezed through a narrow gap, just barely escaping with their lives. Panting, they rushed back to the glade and gathered everyone. "We found a way out," Thomas announced. Excited whispers spread among the gladers. But not everyone was convinced. Gally stepped forward, his expression dark. "This could be a trap," he argued. An intense argument broke out between him and Thomas. Tension filled the air. Then, "Thomas, come quick!" Teresa's voice rang out. Everyone turned. "Albie is awake!" Rushing inside, they found Albie sitting up, his face pale but alert. His first words? "You'll never escape now." Silence fell over the room. Albie's gaze locked onto Thomas. "They always liked you the most," he muttered. Confusion flickered across Thomas's face. "Why are you here, Thomas?" Before he could answer, a loud, grinding sound echoed outside. Everyone ran to see what was happening, and their eyes widened in shock. The maze's exit had not closed today. Instead, new doors had opened. Thomas wanted to come up with a plan, but there was no time. The Grievers were already charging toward them at terrifying speed. Panic spread through the Gladers. Screams filled the air as some boys were caught, helpless victims of the monstrous creatures. Gally and a few others hid inside the box, hoping to avoid the attack. Thomas, Teresa, and several others ducked into the tall fields, trying to stay out of sight. But then, a Griever's massive tail lashed out, grabbing a boy. He screamed, thrashing, trying desperately to reach his friends. But one by one, more boys were being snatched away. Then, a Griever lunged forward, blocking their escape route. Thinking fast, Teresa grabbed a lantern and hurled it toward the creature. Flames erupted. The Griever shrieked, writhing in pain. "Run!" Someone shouted. They all sprinted, dodging through the chaos. Then suddenly, Albie tripped. He hit the ground hard. At that very moment, a Griever loomed over him, its claws outstretched. Thomas acted on instinct. He jumped in front of the creature, holding up the mysterious device. For a split second, the Griever hesitated, and that was all the time the others needed. The hunters attacked the creature, forcing it back. Taking their chance, Thomas and the rest bolted toward a nearby hut, diving inside for cover. They barely had time to catch their breath when, crash! A Griever dropped from the roof, smashing through the ceiling. It grabbed another boy, and then turned toward Chuck. The creature's metal limbs lashed out, ready to snatch him next. But Thomas and his friends rushed in, fighting with everything they had. After a fierce struggle, they managed to save Chuck. But in the chaos, Albie was taken. When the attack was finally over, they stepped outside. Silence hung heavy in the air, and then they realized. Apart from them, the only survivors were those who had hidden inside the box. The Gladers stood there, shaken, staring at the destruction around them. What now? Gally attacked Thomas. Fueled by anger, he rained down punches, blaming Thomas for everything that had happened. But Thomas wasn't fighting back, because even now, he still didn't have the answers he needed. And so, in a reckless move, he grabbed the Griever's poison-filled stinger and injected himself. Darkness swallowed him instantly. In his unconscious state, he saw the dream again. He was in a lab, standing beside Teresa. Through the glass, he saw boys undergoing strange experiments. Everything felt eerily familiar. But before he could make sense of it, he woke up. When he opened his eyes, Teresa was by his side. A few boys stood nearby, watching him cautiously. They told him that while he was unconscious, Gally had seized control of everything. He had convinced everyone that Thomas was to blame for everything. But Thomas didn't argue. Instead, he accepted responsibility. And then he told them the truth. "This isn't just a maze," he said. "It's a test, an experiment run by a company called Wicked." Shock rippled through the group as he continued. "Teresa and we used to work for them." A tense silence followed. Then, some boys dragged Thomas and Teresa toward Gally. He stood before the stone wall, carving a deep scratch over another name, the names of all those who had died. And now, Gally wanted Thomas and Teresa gone. He planned to send them back into the maze. But this time, some of the boys hesitated, because deep down they sensed that Thomas might actually know the way out. And at that moment, Thomas saw his chance. Thomas broke free from the guards. With a swift movement, he freed himself. And at that very moment, Minho stepped forward, pressing his blade against Gally's throat. The room fell silent. Then Thomas spoke, his voice steady. "We're leaving," he announced, "for good." His eyes scanned the crowd. "If anyone wants to come with us, this is your chance." Gally scoffed. Only a fool would follow him, he thought. But in the very next second, several boys stepped forward, one after another. And soon, it was clear, they were no longer under Gally's control. Their escape began. Racing through the twisting corridors of the maze, they finally reached the massive door leading to Section C. But before they could enter, a Griever appeared. It lunged forward, its grotesque limbs thrashing wildly. The boys fought back fiercely, using every trick they had learned. Yet, despite their efforts, some fell into the deep abyss below. In the chaos, Teresa hurled the device, but it slipped. Tumbling toward the ditch, Chuck rushed forward. Just as he grabbed the device, his eyes widened. Another Griever was climbing up from the darkness. "Look out!" he shouted. Without hesitation, he hurled the monster back into the pit with all his strength. But their troubles weren't over. 2 more grievers charged at them. Screams echoed through the maze as more boys were taken. But Teresa and Chuck worked frantically, and finally, the door opened. Beyond the door, another obstacle. A second, massive door blocked their path. This one required an 8-digit code. Thomas stared at it, realization hitting him. "It's the maze," he murmured. "The sections, they form the code." Without wasting another second, Minho began reciting the sequence. Time was running out, and behind them, the grievers were closing in. Time was slipping away. Minho had just started reciting the sequence, but before he could finish, someone interrupted. "The code," the boy gasped, out of breath. "It must be made from the sequence of the maze sections." Minho nodded, continuing. But then, a griever struck. With a terrifying screech, the creature lunged at Minho. But before it could reach him, another boy leaped forward. He tackled the griever, trying to distract it, and in that brutal moment, Minho seized the chance. He shouted the final numbers. The door slid open. The maze began collapsing. Walls shifted and crashed behind them. There was no time to look back. They raced through the opening, dodging falling debris. And finally, they emerged into a long, futuristic tunnel. Bright lights flickered overhead, stretching endlessly before them. The air was sterile, unnervingly silent. It was nothing like the maze. And yet, somehow, it felt even more unsettling. Then they saw it. At the end of the tunnel stood a lab, cold, sterile, lifeless. Scattered across the floor, the bodies of scientists and guards, their faces frozen in horror. The room was lined with monitors and cameras blinking silently. It took only a second for them to realize they had been watched. Every move, every decision, 24 hours a day. Then Thomas pressed a button, and the truth began to reveal itself. A screen flickered to life in front of them. A woman appeared, the same one Thomas had seen in his dreams. Her name was Dr. Ava Page, the director of Wicked. In the video, Ava revealed a terrifying truth. Years ago, the sun had scorched the earth. Oceans dried up. Cities turned to dust. Survival became impossible. Then came something even worse. The flare virus. It spread like wildfire, turning people into something unimaginable. Humanity was on the brink of extinction. But over time, a new generation began to resist the virus. And Wicked needed to understand why. That's why they were here. The maze was never about survival. It was an experiment. They were just test subjects. Before the video could explain more, Ava was shot. The screen went dark. The room fell into stunned silence. Then Gally appeared. His eyes were hollow. Something was wrong. Teresa instantly realized he had been infected. Before anyone could react, he raised a gun and fired. The bullet ripped through the air and hit Chuck. The boy gasped, staggering back. Thomas rushed forward, catching him before he fell. Chuck's small hands trembled as he handed Thomas a worn-out doll. With his last breath, he whispered, "Thank you." Thomas's vision blurred with rage. Before Gally could fire again, Minho struck. His spear pierced through Gally's chest. The boy collapsed. It was over. Then, a door slid open. Soldiers stormed in. Shouts echoed through the lab as they were rushed out into a waiting helicopter. The nightmare was finally over, or so they thought. Because as they lifted off, far below, Dr. Ava Page watched them go. Alive, smirking, and in a chilling voice, she whispered, "Thomas is exactly where we want him to be." And their escape was just another phase of the experiment. The real fight for survival has only just begun.